Public Affairs Forum of WZTV Fox 17. And now your host, Dr. James Haney.
Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is domestic violence, and we're fortunate to have with us two persons to talk about domestic violence. Ms. Susan Cannon, who is the director of the organization PEACE, Peace, and Mr. Mark Wynn, who is with the Metro Police Department. And of course, Mr. Wynn is an authority on family and domestic violence. And let me welcome both of you, Ms. Cannon and Mr. Wynn, to the show this morning. Ms. Cannon, let's start off with you by having you to give us some information about your background and your education and some of the things that were important in leading you to the director of PEACE, the Domestic Violence Program here in Nashville, Tennessee. And of course, after you do that, Mr. Wynn will give us the same information, same kind of information. Then we'll get into the topic of domestic violence this morning.
Yes. I have an undergraduate degree in social work and a Master's of Divinity from Vanderbilt Divinity School with a specialty in ethics. And I've worked for the Peace Organization for the last 6 years. And when I completed my Divinity School degree, I'm not an ordained minister, but I do feel that the work that I do in the community is a form of ministry. And early on, after getting out of school, I worked with a rehabilitation program, people coming out of prisons and helping them to get settled in the community to become law-abiding citizens. And then I joined with Peace 6 years ago, and have always felt a need to work with the most needy, and indeed I think that victims of domestic violence and trying to rehabilitate perpetrators of domestic violence fits into that category.
Now, the organization PEACE, now what does that stand for?
It stands for Project to End Abuse Through Counseling and Education. Project
to End Abuse Through Counseling and Education.
That's correct.
Very good. Sergeant Wynn, let's talk about your background and some of the information that is important in your...
Okay. My education in family violence is rooted in 10 years of being a victim of family violence. As a child, I grew up in a home filled with domestic violence. So I had sort of a grassroots education in it. As I became a police officer, it gave me the opportunity to learn the police sciences so I could reach out to the police community to try to make them understand that family violence is a serious crime and it shouldn't be minimized, it shouldn't be mediated, and it should be treated as a serious offense. And thank goodness I've been given that arena. For the last 8 years, I've worked for the Department of Justice, and I've traveled in 37 states throughout the United States counseling with police chiefs, with police officers, with district attorneys, with judges on how to set up model programs and to deal with victims of family violence. I've also trained in 3 other countries on the same issue. So I've been real busy here in the last 8 years, but my education, for the most part, comes from being a victim of this terrible crime.
And you bring a whole array of experiences and information dealing with this as a topic this morning.
Police officers' perspective on victims of family violence and a past victims' perspective on family violence.
Very good. Ms. Cannon, let's look at domestic violence, and to have you to sort of give us a summary of exactly what do we mean when we talk about domestic violence. I think that Sergeant Wynn has already thrown something into the whole discussion by talking about family violence. I think that very rarely do we talk about family violence and domestic violence, and I think that we sort of confuse the two. Let's talk about that this morning and talk about those distinctions.
Well, certainly when we talk about family violence, we're talking about all of those possible violences that can occur within the home, whether that be spousal or intimate relationship abuse or, of course, child abuse. And our agency, the Peace Program, focuses with the problem of intimate relationship abuse. We're working with men who have a problem with being violent toward their intimate loved one. And you'll hear me talking a lot about male violence perpetrated against females. That constitutes 95% of the problem, and so that is our primary focus. We also know with the situation of intimate relationship violence occurring in the home, over 50% of the cases where there's violence against the intimate loved one, the wife or the girlfriend, there's also violence against the children. So the two are very, very related, and even though they are, you know, different agencies may work with different aspects of the problem, they're very interrelated. And in our program, we do address the problem of child abuse, although our primary focus is with intimate relationship abuse.
And hence, Sergeant Wynn, I would imagine that's why you talk about family violence, some of the same reasons that you...
Right. I like to think of it as a wider range of crimes, not just when you say domestic, but all those things that Susan's talked about, including elder abuse, where the elderly are abused when it comes to another family member. If we look at it in a broader sense, we see a clear picture of just how heavy a toll this crime takes on everybody.
How pervasive is domestic violence?
About 6 million women each year in the United States are the victim of domestic violence, at least one incident. We know that locally, and Mark can talk a lot more about the local statistics, but last year in 1993, 25 women lost their lives as a result of injuries incurred in a domestic violence situation. So it's a very hidden problem. A lot of the statistics that we get from the National Association Against Domestic Violence will be those that are documented by police departments or FBI reports. So much of domestic violence goes underreported. It may be reported to family members or to physicians and that sort of thing, but so much of domestic violence, the statistics that we have are underreported statistics.
It really doesn't reach the proper authorities to become a part of the statistical information dealing with it.
So often it does not.
What can you say, Sergeant Wynn, in reference to that, in terms of statistics?
The numbers are around 50%. Only 50% report for a lot of reasons, and one of the biggest reasons is fear. Fear of retaliation, of actually picking the phone up and calling the police and saying, my husband, my boyfriend, my loved one has just assaulted me. It takes a lot of courage for somebody to do that. And the shelter, which has a crisis line call-in for victims, tells us that they only call the crisis line in some cases after the 5th assault. Not us, but only after the 5th assault. So it's a process of building enough courage up to call for help. So like Susan says, there's a lot of the numbers we don't see. We get, every year in Davidson County, we get around 18,000 calls of domestic violence.
That's annually 18,000 calls?
Annually. So if you take that number of 50% don't report, so you're looking at, what, 36,000 real incidents, which would make it the most committed.
And almost 1,000 incidents a month at least.
Right, right. Right now the district attorney's office tells us they're prosecuting around 500 cases of family violence in their court systems. So there's a big number of victims who don't even use the police. They go straight before the courts to get a warrant. And so those people we don't even know exist as far as the police department goes.
Now, Ms. Cannon, what are some of the causes? I mean,